Welcome back to the room where it happened. Hey, I got that right. I didn't slip over and mention the sister podcast name there, which is what I was actually in my mind going, don't do it, don't do it, don't do it. It's been about a year since we put out a room where it happened. So it's good to be back with the team here. The team that I see on my screen includes, in no particular order, I'll just go around. It includes Eric Rush, who I just saw has I think his traditional beverage for recording there, which is always a good thing to see.
No, this is water
This
tonight.
is water. Okay. Okay. So he's serious tonight. That's a sign that he is serious tonight. Also got Dylan Holzheimer here. Dylan, how
Hi,
are you doing
everybody.
this
Doing
evening?
good.
Good. Got Robert Koshy. Robert, how are you today?
Good, good.
And we will hear from Chris Capola every once in a while because
Hi,
he is.
good people.
There you go. I was just going to get that out because he's actually joining us while he's in transit, and so I know a lot of our listeners in the old days, but when we actually drove to work, probably listen to the podcast, in the car. Now it's the other way around. The podcast is being recorded with at least one member of the team from the car, so we're trying to cover you always here.
So we consider him our field correspondent.
Yeah,
There
I was
you go.
actually thinking he was showing us a little bit of the traffic considerations. I was thinking about so often now, like the local news, when they're rolling a report of the scene, you basically get like their iPhone, or their smartphone streaming back to the station kind of thing. That now sort of serves as the live cam in so many ways. So Chris is our live cam, and he's driving.
You can go ahead and laugh because I am literally coming up on a building right now that has MSNBC, Fox News, and CNN studios all facing the Capitol. They're all like different floors of each other. So I've always wondered if, Fox News like gets on top or there's some kind of rivalry and people intentionally like drop balls on the floor to disrupt the sound of the studio below them. I've never heard of this, but I feel like that's what post-production's for.
Yeah, and it's also appropriate that you actually gave us a great intro there, Chris, because we're gonna our topic is going to be focusing on Rome, and we're going to do that as we do on the room where it happened from a room. In this case, the room we'll be doing is actually where the Senate met. Actually, the third place the Senate met is where we're going to do this. We'll talk about the others. It's the Curia Julia in Rome. And it's interesting because Chris there is in the DC area passing by the Capitol. So one end of that large building there contains another Senate. And we'll talk about why, that is the case and maybe the influence of that as we go through here. We were just talking about, as of today, this is a funded U.S. government. But, by the time you listen to this podcast, depending on when you download it, who knows? But we're not going to go there. So I've got the crew here. I wanted to throw out the concept of just Rome in general. And then, swing back around to the room itself. The room, just the appropriate thing to do. That's what we do on the podcast. This is actually the third place that the Senate had met. And this was sort of, as I understand it, Julius Caesar's, this was the Senate location that Julius built and got it built basically just in time to also be the place where Julius got stabbed. So that's also why it's also a relevant place to be. But I just want to throw out to the team in general here, Rome. When you hear Rome, what do you think? And why is it that we are so fascinated, essentially I'll just generally call it Western civilization, by the concept of Rome? Rome. And I'll let anybody who wants to jump in go first there. What is it about Rome that compels us to actually want to talk about it?
I'll throw out. It's just its impact from the Pax Roma that enabled Western civilization to expand, to the Roman roads the funny meme floating around that Roman road built 3,000 years ago, still in use today. Street built by my city 6 months ago, potholes and falling apart already. The Romans they had it together to a certain extent. And I think the longevity of the Roman Empire and what it morphed into and what it changed, I think that just sets it up as the thing that's going to give us the most fascination, has something to look at. Not to mention, we're going to have to go there. So, et tu, Brute, so.
It's relevant because it impacts. Eric, were you about to say something, I think?
Yeah, no, and I agree with everything that Robert said. But I also think it's in some ways it's the structure of our government. Is that we have a part of Congress that is the Senate, that in many reasons or in many ways, not maybe so much these days with direct elections, but certainly the way the Constitution was originally conceived of, with indirect appointment of senators, felt very similar to the Roman Senate. And so I think there's a part of that that still resonates with a lot of us.
So it's an influence on our politics, and in this case, it's interesting there because one of the things that Dylan and I talked about on an episode of A Fork in Time. By the way, we're going to have a series of episodes on A Fork in Time that are companion to this episode here on The Room Where It Happened. That are going to be looking at historical forks of the Roman era, and the first one of those is going to be on the Battle of Actium. And one of the things we were talking about there is just this concept of, I heard Robert use the term correctly. We think about the influence of the Roman Empire, but the period of time that we're talking about here, when the Curia Julia is the new room du jour, the third place the Senate has met, they wouldn't have called themselves an empire. What would they have called themselves, for goodness sakes?
They were the Roman Republic.
The Republic. And even that's an interesting concept to me, because even once they become empire, they think of themselves still as republic. That's part of their identity and how they go from there. And go ahead, Chris.
That's one of the interesting things about, I think this room works. It's appropriate for us, but I just feel like by the time that Caesar builds it, the political innovation of Caesar is to make the Senate not matter anymore. So as soon as this is actually the room where they're meeting, a lot of the classical debates in the Senate, I'm thinking about around the Punic Wars, I'm thinking about all of the, Cicero's debates, all of these, almost by definition, happen before the Senate starts meeting in this physical room.
Well, and I think that's a good metaphor for where Rome is in this point. The Curia of Pompey was a stopgap. They were building it just so that they could have a new temple, and they were originally going to have the Senate meet in the broader temple. And this was just kind of like a filling in point. They were trying to just figure out, oh, okay, this is where we're going to meet right now, because everything else is under construction. Much like the Republic as a whole had been essentially under deconstruction for the last 60, 70 years, ever since the civil wars of Marius and Sulla, that it has essentially rendered the Senate, if not irrelevant, certainly non-functioning in the normal sense. So the idea of the Curia as the room where eventually it all comes tumbling down is kind of a very apropos metaphor for, Rome as a whole in this time period, I think.
But as a counterpoint, I do like the idea of the ad hoc nature of Roman government. Thinking about the tribunes were not part of the post-Tarquin political structure. The involvement of the lower classes, of the plebs, in the public assemblies comes about because of basically a general strike they called, so that they could have some political involvement. So the Roman Republic did develop ad hoc. They didn't sit down and to kind of harken back to the episodes we did about the generational constitution, there was never any constitutional convention for the Roman Republic. They overthrew the kings, and they had the Roman Republic itself was stopgap, and it did evolve over time.
Right.
Yeah, I think the irony is that, these days you hear, some, if you know anything about Marxist rhetoric, you hear about the battle of the proletariat versus sort of the bourgeoisie, but this is essentially just a historical trend that Rome encapsulates in and of itself. They go from a king to a deposition by the common folk, who then become, the nobles, who then are interfered with by the tribunes of the plebs, who then basically let the mob come back into the picture, who are then deposed by what becomes a singular, all-powerful state ruled over by one man. It's a microcosm of the general trend of history.
Well before Hegel's dialectic thought, and well before Marx capitalized on it, right?
Exactly.
There's nothing new under the sun is the thing that pops into my head there.
It just repeats.
Yeah,
Well,
history
and-
history doesn't repeat; it just vamps on itself.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and has it come down that the Senate is still around and still quote unquote functioning, but by the time we're at we'll just say Nero, it's a body that's kind of rubber stamping. I almost think, and I'll throw my sci-fi geekdom down. It almost becomes the Republic Senate in Star Wars in the prequel movies, where it's just kind of rubber stamping whatever the Supreme Chancellor or the Emperor wants. It's not really a Senate who's governing per se.
Yeah, and in case anybody's wondering, there, George Lucas obviously just directly stole from history
Oh,
the thing that people clearly understood, in much the same way that George R.R. Martin steals readily from history all over the place and reweaves it for Game of Thrones. Does it masterfully. That's not to take anything away, but it's this concept of the same themes and the same things that are going on across.
If it works for Hegel, let's let it work for Lucas.
There you go. Which just about covers the widest spectrum that I can imagine in my head, probably at this point. One of the things that really jumped out at me, I studied for a year and a half in college. I studied Latin. That was the language that I studied. And what I remember, that was my first exposure. I guess I probably should have gotten it before, but that was my first exposure because of having to translate it to what we see so often portrayed, which is historically accurate, the SPQR that relates to Rome. And throwing what little bit of Latin I remember here, and that's really about the end of it here. And again, I can say it however I want to, because we don't actually know what Latin sounds like. That's one of the wonderful things about a dead language is the pronunciation is sort of in your own head. But basically SPQR is Senatus Populusque Roma Romana, which means the Senate and people of Rome. The Q there is the que on the end of the word that is the and the S is the Senate, the P is the people, and the R is the Rome, and that SPQR. And so even once we get down into the imperial age of Rome, again, the mythology, it's still the SPQR. It's still, this is being done as, Robert was describing there, the rubber stamping Senate body. It was still the Senate and people of Rome, as, Nero is telling them that it's going to be, kind of thing, or as whoever, eventually we were talking about on the episode, which we would encourage you to listen to. The next episode you'll find on A Fork in Time is talking about the period that is the Battle of Actium. So it's bringing us into the Pax Romana. It's bringing us into this age where Octavian becomes this guy named Augustus Caesar and sort of establishes, the real one person rule that's there. So getting back to the concept of the room, which is what we do on the room where it happened, 44 BC. The middle of March 15th, 44 BC, the Ides of March, something obviously happens in this room. And it ties back to, Chris has alluded it to, the fact that Rome drew out of overthrowing its king, and then, through the whole process there, what's gone on there. So is that the biggest event in the room that we've picked here, or can you guys think of something better? I guess I'm just going to throw out the concept of Caesar's assassination, being deposed. What to call it gets a little bit tricky. Assassination, I guess, is the correct word. Happens in the Senate itself. It happens in this place. So just thoughts on that, and is there something that tops that as being maybe the most historically influential event in that room?
Well, Don, I think it was the most significant event in that particular room that day. I mean, that would be hard. That would be hard to top. And I look at this, and I think it's Shakespeare aside, making some assumptions about accuracy. This is the first accurate date we have for a political assassination that I can come up with. So, I mean, you have, November 22nd, 1963, but you also have March 15th, 44 BC. Like, we know those days.
Yeah.
And, so this is a real turning point in history. And it goes back to the things that Robert was saying about how important Rome was. And, not just at the time, but also for how we conceive of civilization, how we conceive of government, how we conceive of longevity of a society. And this is a real reflection point in that. And that still happened over 2,000 years ago. So I think it is the most important event that happened in that room that day.
Yeah, I would concur with that. Others have other thoughts on that?
I'm going to have to go with Eric. I think it's not only that day, but it in essence sets up the future Caesars of the Roman Empire. That assassination and the fallout of the wars and the settling of it really tend to set up the future Caesars. And so in reality, thinking they're saving the Roman Republic from the dictatorship of one man, they end up creating the Roman dictatorship with rule by one man from an emperor with this.
So to use your Star Wars analogy, Robert, this is the Anakin Skywalker of rooms?
Basically, yes.
So I'm going to be contrarian here.
Imagine that, Chris the contrarian. Who would have thunk it?
Yeah, I don't, and I wish I could put my finger on the date that I think is more important. I will go ahead and concede Eric's point that it's the most important thing that happened that day. But my argument would be, I think the decisions of the Senate to acquiesce to Octavius, to give him that recognition as Principes and to solidify his control. And the reason I say that is basically when Caesar's assassinated, he's another Sulla. He's a general that has marched into Rome and taken extraordinary powers unto himself. And I don't really see anything that Caesar had done as setting up necessarily at that point the empire itself. He hadn't established the political institutions that led to the empire. So
I agree with you, Chris. I think you're exactly right. I think that it's not so much that it was these events on this day that directly led to what we conceive of as the Roman Empire, although directly they certainly created the environment that allowed that to happen. But I agree with you. I think I think the field was open for Julius Caesar to have a variety of different ways of influencing Rome, including taking over and I think again it was the fear of taking over as king, and so there was a variety of influences that were available to him, and we will never really know what he would have chosen which direction he would have chosen to go. Now we know what Octavian wanted, and we know what the Senate what they created for him to be able to do that. And so I would say that directly, I think Chris is spot on that these are subsequent events that really created directly what we conceive as the Roman Empire. But I would equally argue that what happened in 44 BC was necessary as being permissive for that environment to flourish.
I would actually go almost the other direction. I realized that they didn't have the Curia when this happened, but you could, really a lot of this is just sort of ripple effects that go back from earlier decisions like, because Caesar is Caesar in everybody's heads, but there were plenty of other men who could have become a Caesar. You could say that all of this really kind of came about because of the Gracchi brothers' agrarian reforms or the army becoming more focused on a commanding general or whatever. But it also came about when the Senate acquiesced to Pompey raising his own army at 23 or whatever to help go off and fight, Spartacus and Mithridates. And, basically the Senate beginning this precedent that they continued with Caesar and then with Octavian of sort of either abdicating by choice their sort of governing responsibility or just using the tool of convenience to fix a problem that they really should have been more functional to be able to make decisions on themselves, but instead they just went, oh, this guy seems to be a good commander, we're going to let him go beat the enemy of the day.
Please understand what happened last night when you're saying about the Senate abdicating responsibility and just kicking things down. I mean, that's kind of amazing, isn't it?
I mean, it is good timing, I'll say that, or bad timing, depending on your philosophical perspective.
Well, let's talk again in 45 days.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, and one of the curious things to me is, again, we talked about the influence thing here, sort of the initial thing that Robert said when I threw out the question of, why do we pay attention to Rome? Why do we care? Well, we see it in our institutions. We were talking about the fact that, one of the two houses of the United States legislative branch is named the Senate. To Eric's point earlier, it was intentionally designed to have more of a patrician feel to it, than it does now as the result of direct election. But obviously there's this nod towards the concept of Roman political structure that was, the founding fathers of the United States incorporated from. By the way, the Romans probably borrowed a lot of that, the concepts of democratic representation and other things from Greece. Everything gets borrowed around here in the early part of the world there. But I do think it's fascinating that, we talk about the particular event here, Julius Caesar's assassination. I love Dylan's point. He just happens to be the one. He just happens to be Julius Caesar. There were plenty of Julius Caesar wannabes or could have beens, both before and then, certainly afterwards. Is that the stated reason for killing Caesar in 44 BC is so that he would not become king. And as somebody mentioned earlier, the indirect result of that was his named heir, following some additional conflict, eventually assumes that role. It had the boomerang effect in terms of what it did. In trying to prevent someone from becoming king, you ultimately empowered somebody to be king. But it does go back, I think, to the concept in my mind of the Senate had authority, but it was a political thing. And so it was going to be constantly in this thing of strife, different, there were parties in terms of who they favored, those types of things. And like it or not, that's also the echo that we get all the way down today that is also from Rome. I think part of the reason we're fascinated by Roman history is we see events, we've already mentioned some of them here, that are just echoes of things that happened 2,000 years ago, just in a slightly different format and a slightly different form. Yes, I chose that word intentionally. Any thoughts on that? I have an idea about a different topic to jump to, but I don't want to cut short our, Julius Caesar becoming Julius Caesar, and then the rise of Octavian becoming Augustus.
Well, I think there's really just this is one of those topics that there's just so many different ways that we could go because it's so ingrained into, the ideas that we're used to in our modern world. And it really all boils down to the fact that the Romans were basically just pathologically afraid of monarchy for several hundred years. The Senate, somehow they managed to create an oligarchic, semi-representative form of government that was both legislative, executive, and judicial, all in one, sort of wrapping. Normally, you would think of that as, if someone just threw that out, that said, okay, it's an oligarchy, it's your judiciary, your executive, and your legislative all in one form, you'd say, oh, that's a monarchy. They somehow managed to figure out a way to still do that, but have it be like 500 people instead of one person and still screw it up.
Yeah, they perfected oligarchy. Is that what you're saying, Dylan? They sort of.
I don't know that anyone has perfected it or can perfect it, but they certainly found they certainly gave the best example in the dictionary for it.
Yeah.
But I would argue one of the reasons that they were able to do it so well is because it wasn't stayed. It was not the same families that overthrew the Tarquins being still the senators at this point.
Except it was. Guess who Brutus was descended from?
But okay, who were Cicero's descendants?
A bunch of people named after chickpeas.
That the point being, yes, they did maintain those families, but the system was built in such a way that it allowed the incorporation of talent and incorporation of people, so that you didn't have basically a French Ancien regime that explicitly keeps out dynamic forces.
True. I'll give you that.
Well, and the other thing that goes with that, Chris, in fact, it's an interesting segue to something that Dylan and I talk about on that Fork in Time episode, is a little bit of this concept of what it meant for someone to assume that authority and how they assume that authority. And we've already made the reference here. Caesar was when I say Caesar, I'm talking about Julius Caesar here, obviously, keeping it straight. He was a patrician. So he had the right to, sort of be where he was by birth. You had to be with, but his rise to power was not because of politics. It was a general who was really good at self-promotion, by the way. And back to Dylan's point, the whole structure of the system was if you were in certain offices, you could also suit could not be brought against you in this form. And so one of the reasons that Caesar kept, vying for office and doing the things that were there was he was afraid of essentially being tried for war crimes or raising to the point raising armies or raising forces that he shouldn't have. It was this interesting concept of either Eric or Chris said or maybe somebody said this idea of it was not Chris said it was not state enough. There was structure, but there was no constitutional convention to this. So the structure could modify and morph and change and did over time. And it was a vehicle for talented individuals. I think that was your term, Robert, to find their way up through the system. And they did it different ways. Cicero through oratory, Pompey and Julius Caesar through military service. There was more. Octavian from just happening to be the lucky grandnephew, the lucky nephew that gets, tagged. I mean, different ways to rise up through that system.
Well, and then the system becomes even more weird after that for the succession as it moves forward.
Yeah. But I derailed myself. I had a squirrel moment. I sort of took myself out of line. But the whole concept is if you don't have Rome, what it's becoming here in 44 BC, what it ultimately become, arguably probably 27 BC is the start of the Pax Romana when you see, Octavian, now Augustus, consolidating the hold that he has after the Battle of Actium in 31, is that eventually that Rome is then able to solidify its position. It turns towards Europe. And so eventually, you're going to have the expansions beyond where Julius Caesar had been in Gaul, but now they're up into the Germanic territories. Because of that influence, there's the influence on what will become European history, what will become the other cultural groups that are there as well. This is how Rome permeates down to today, is because Rome became empire, was stout enough, I think Eric said this, to last for a really long period of time, and then have an influence on our laws, on our structures for politics and for government, on our culture, all the things that go from there that are Roman, which is why they come down to today.
Well, and it's like what Chris said is, when the Romans overthrew their king, they essentially, they didn't create a written constitution. They created the 12 tables for, hey, here's all of our Roman laws after a couple hundred years. But, the senatorial republican structure was designed for a city state. The fact that the Romans could take what essentially was a municipal city charter or city council and make it work for an empire that stretched from, Scotland to the Gulf of Oman is kind of remarkable. The fact that they could take something that should have only worked to govern, a couple dozen square miles and made it govern a couple thousand. I mean, it's kind of incredible when you think about it.
Yeah. And even back to a point that Robert made early on, talk about Roman roads, for example. One of the fascinating things to me, the more I've studied and come to understand Roman military history, is, the magic of much of Roman military history is coupled with Roman engineering and these were soldiers, but these were soldiers who knew how to build appropriate things that aided their soldiering. The particular thing I think of is the siege of Masada, which is going to be some number of years later. I mean, that's a mountaintop fortress that is going to take, and it takes a while for it to happen. But one of the reasons it's able to happen is the Roman legions that were there weren't just handy with the gladius; they were handy with the shovel, and they knew what to do. And you see this over and over again in Roman history. Those roads were built and maintained by the soldiers that were using them to get from one part of the empire to the other, and the communication that went with that is Rome's infrastructure. As much as anything, the thing that Dylan just described, but Rome's infrastructure, to Robert's point, one of the first things that was made there enabled it to be what it was and what it became.
Oh, and not only that, but to Dylan's point, talking about a city state, they were handing out. You could be a citizen of Rome, having never set foot in Rome before. Saul of Tarsus, the apostle who we refer to as the Apostle Paul, he was a Roman citizen. He was born in Judea and hung out, but he had all the rights and privileges of a Roman citizen at some level. And so, passing it out and how they were doling those out kind of, I think, enabled that city-state to grow and move forward. And not only that, but if you look at it from the longer period of history, after 70 AD, when they destroyed Jerusalem, what was the plan? Anybody remember? They were going to build it for the retired Roman legionnaires to move to. That was the entire plan of once they wiped out the city, it was going to be rebuilt and resettled with retired Roman legions.
I have a legal question, Dylan. So it's good that we have Dylan here. Robert made an interesting point there, talking about the rights of a Roman citizen. I mean, the concept of certain political rights existing in societies was not unique to Rome. It had happened previously in history, but isn't it also somewhat unique to what Robert described there, this idea of the informal codification of it meant something to be a Roman citizen in terms of what that meant for your rights. And of course, that gets incorporated to some degree down today through the Western civilization carrying forward of that. Is that a fair way to think about that, or am I naive in terms of how I think about that?
No, that's a fair way to think about it. You just have to remember that some of that was marketing. The Romans very much cultivated this, and that's part of why this version of oligarchy was so brilliant, is because the Romans, whether by design or just through sort of natural evolution, they had created through their system of government and their culture a way where oligarchy was the ideal. You had the Senate as this sort of elite group at the top who, yes, did have all the power, but everybody from the bottom was constantly coming into the funnel and wanted to move up. Everybody who wasn't Roman in the provinces wanted to become Roman, whether just to be in the city itself, which is how it got to be over 1 million people, or become a Roman citizen. Everyone who wanted to be a Roman citizen wanted to either be a richer Roman citizen, a more important Roman citizen, or just a better Roman citizen. You have this remarkable sort of reverse funnel that takes everybody and shoots it towards the top. Roman citizens not only had the ability to vote, but there were certain rights, like obviously mercantile advantages. You had trade advantages if you were a Roman citizen. You had freedom of travel. This is one of the first civilizations where citizenship sort of is equated to a kind of freedom of travel moment. But really, it's kind of this emblem of citizenship as both the ultimate idea of service to the state, and it's the ultimate status symbol. On the one hand, you have, I'm a Roman, I'm better than everybody else. I'm someone who belongs to the most powerful political entity in the Mediterranean. But at the same time, I'm a Roman. I have a duty to further the republic, the city-state, for the glory of Rome, for the benefit of Rome. It's this really interesting combination of rights and responsibilities that to get back to our discussion at the beginning, is probably underneath everything else, probably the most enduring idea that's left over from this time period. This idea that belonging to a certain nation state or citizenship group, whatever it is, not only carries with it responsibilities, but also obligations and a duty in some sense.
I do. You touched on something that I do want to talk about a little bit, which is the non-citizens of Rome and their importance right before this time period, in terms of how many of them had served in the Punic Wars, how many of them had been in Marius's army, how many of them had given something to the state, and the role of, like we have talked about, this patchwork constitution of the Roman Republic, that if you are from one city, you have certain rights. If you're from another allied city, you have other rights. And the competition between these things, which of these things do you belong to, and how important you can almost see in the social wars, which happen maybe basically during the childhood of most of the people of this time frame, right around the time of Sulla, right around the 180s, almost a nationalism of Romans, where there is kind of a leveling and a establishing of what you're talking about. That was a relative, there had been Roman citizens, but the expansion of that and the extension of those rights to other people of the Italian peninsula, I think, is a really important, it is almost a proto-nationalism for this time frame.
Yeah, I think that, and a combination of that as sort of a proto-nationalism, and that gets to kind of the marketing comment, was, the social war was the advertisement once the Italian peninsula got their citizenship, was that, hey, everybody else has a chance to get this too. But that gets to what was kind of the behind the scenes problem that led to Julius Caesar's actual assassination, to kind of bring the whole ship, full circle, is, this is, the Roman Senate is a Senate made up of individuals, which sounds like a truism, but if you understand the way that the Roman political system worked, is every senator had a client base, which is people that they did favors for, who owed them. It's essentially it's like Don Corleone at the beginning of The Godfather, where he's, you come to me the night of my daughter's wedding and ask me to do such and such. The men would owe favors and owe loyalty to these various senators, and the more important of a senator you were, the more powerful your clientele were, which is how, Caesar and Pompey ended up in this giant knockdown, drag out fight that led to the end of the Republic. Is you started, what started with expanding citizenship to the Italian peninsula and the social wars ended with literally two senators, Caesar and Pompey, having clients who controlled entire kingdoms that could destroy their own government for the sake of the egos of these two people, necessitating the Senate to plot and try and, murder the one who ended up victorious, because the client system was,
or frankly, the client system and the extension of that citizenship created so much power for the Senate to actually discharge that, like you were saying earlier, it just advocated it.
Yeah.
Well, in fact, Dylan made the Godfather reference there. It's always a good episode if you can reference The Godfather, Godfather Part 2. But if you remember the scene from The Godfather where, it's the prison scene. I guess it's when Tom Higgins goes to visit
Frank Pentangeli.
Yeah, and he says, basically how the mob chose to structure itself was modeled on what we talk about, in some ways the American government system being modeled on things that were Roman, right? The mob also modeled itself on things that were Roman because of the oligarchy element of what's there, and even that might be true obviously of the American political system too.
I also do want it noted, I'm not the one that went to The Godfather.
Well noted, Chris. Well noted, Chris. But to me the obvious, the Venn diagram in my head right now, and sadly my head is always filled with lots of Venn diagrams. Where are the overlaps? Is it's equally appropriate for, we talked about, made the reference here and other forms of Western democratic governments, not just the American democratic experience, but certainly that, or the American Republic experience. That's a whole debate right now that goes on and is discussed constantly. But it worked equally well for the framers of the U.S. Constitution, and it worked equally well for the mob. Both of them are inspired by the same thing. Make of that what you will, is what I'll say.
Can I go ahead
here.
and throw another circle in there too, by the way?
Yeah.
Mussolini. He structured his political ideology around the fascist party being a force to establish harmony between capital and labor,
Right.
between the mob forces and the patrician forces, which is a pretty interesting theoretical underpinning directly related to the fights that are going on in the Senate that we're talking about.
Well, and I mean, he used the Roman symbol of
The fasces, the bound sticks.
Exactly. That's the symbol of fascism. That was Caesar literally had that as his symbol of consular authority when he and Pompey were consuls. That was the symbol. You had a guy who had this bundle of sticks so that everyone knew that this was, one of the lead decision makers. This was a man who had imperium, the ability to command troops and command authority, and his person could not be violated, and all these other things.
But the symbolism behind that is that it is a bunch of individual branches grouped together so that they are unbreakable together.
Yes.
It's a really interesting metaphor for state power in general.
Yes. It's a collectivist metaphor for the state.
A place I'm going to go, because it's a relevant place to go, is we talk about the influence of Rome here. Ultimately, in the dying days of what becomes the Roman Empire, or heading towards its dying days, we find ourselves in the 4th century AD. We find ourselves during the time of Constantine. It ain't your daddy's Rome anymore. It's changed a lot by the time it gets to here, to say the least. But we have the situation there where the institution that continues down to this day, for example, uses the idea of the curia as a concept in this, because what ultimately happens is there's the morphing of and the adoption of, we've talked about on the democratic side of things here, but even inside of a religion, in this case Christianity, and the Orthodox branch of it in the form of Catholicism, builds on this foundation that was established by the Roman Empire. It's just another way that this goes forward. So again, I've now, in the Venn diagram, things that overlap that use Rome as a source, we have just about everything you can imagine. And the thing that popped into my head there, this may not make sense as an analogy to anybody else, but it works in my head. I remember reading about this about the time of the movie Forrest Gump. And why was Forrest Gump so popular? Is that almost any political ideology that was in existence in the early 90s could sort of co-opt, and Forrest is us, conservative Republicans. There's elements inside of the character of Forrest Gump that is apolitical, and as a result of that is all political, if that makes any sense. He can be sort of appropriated by anyone. And the thing that was running through my head when we were talking about that is Rome can sort of be appropriated by anyone. You just pick the part of it you want to appropriate and use, whether you're Mussolini, and this is a bad place to go, but I'll go there. Whether you're George Washington, Mussolini, or the Pope, you can get something out of Rome at the end of the day.
Well, it's like Rome is like they're the Batman allegory of history. You either die the hero or you live long enough to let yourself become every possible use to every possible person in the planet.
I'm actually going to take it a weird place. Rome is the Kevin Bacon of history.
Ooh, yes, I like
yes.
that. I like that. The 6 degrees of Rome.
Yeah, there we go. We don't name a Room Where It Happened episodes quite the same way, but Dylan just hit upon what the name ought to be. It is the 6.
No, I think that's right though. I think it is 6 degrees because it's partly that anybody can identify themselves with Rome in some way, but and some of that is sort of marketing, to borrow Dylan's phrase, which I think is absolutely right. But I think also is just anybody can link their ideology in some way to Rome, because guess what? That's the world we're living in. And so you can play 6 degrees with Kevin Bacon with almost anything and have it be somewhat legitimate, even if your ideology itself is not particularly legitimate.
Right.
The
Eric,
one
and
thing I
Eric,
find interesting, though,
go ahead,
I
Chris.
do want to kind of think about the polity that Rome was when it is Jefferson's model of the gentleman, farmer, scholar, politician is a very different polity. When it's Jefferson's state, when it's Jefferson's nation, whatever, it is, I think it was Dylan that said, this is a city council. And it's a very different polity by the time you're getting to where we are. And to rule the entire Mediterranean world, I think part of the shift in the Roman state is because the Roman state shifted.
Well, and I mean, I think that's one of the reasons that Rome has this enduring appeal, because I mean, to use the Jefferson analogy, you know, there's a city in Ohio named after the idyllic Roman farmer Cincinnatus, who became supreme dictator and laid down his sword to go back to his plow. And the time span between when Cincinnatus did that and, you know, the dysfunctional Senate that killed Caesar is, you know, not all that dissimilar from the time span between Jefferson's ideal, you know, republic of farmers and, you know, the people who just barely managed to give us 45 more days before we've got to freak out again.
Yeah, I
So,
think it's
yeah.
the idea of the Kevin Bacon analogy, my force. I think these analogies are relevant because, again, Rome. The reason Rome can be appropriated is it's so broad in terms of what it did and what it means and how enduring it was, but it's also this idea of being able to pick and choose the parts that you like and not the other parts is also the fun part of what goes on there, and it's also because of the influence of, again, being an empire that ruled the area that did, its influence in Europe, which is, where this descends from, the influence on the church is that, Rome, we still see vestiges of so many things that are Roman, even down to today. And so if you, as Dylan and I, as you were talking about on that episode of A Fork in Time, that'll be released here soon, it's, in fact, I think we left it as the hanging question mark, if I remember in the episode, was, okay, we've reached this point. Now we've dissolved Rome as you know it. You tell us in the Discord what you think happens next, kind of thing, because it's hard to imagine the places you would go without Rome becoming what Rome became, what Rome was and what Rome became. It's just so ingrained in the existence that we live in a Western culture that it's hard to pull it out. It's a linchpin.
Yeah, and I think that's the fascinating thing, is because so much of our current understanding of just how the world works is based on how we understand this world and the references we make, which is one of the reasons why it's so fascinating to look at this world, because there's, we grow up and you get, okay, the Senate is named after the Senate and the Republic and blah, blah, blah. But, you look at the things like the idea of separation of powers, which is something that very much is not in the Roman Republic because the Senate did all of it, except for, there were inventions like the Tribune of the Plebs and whatever. But, Rome is such an ingrained facet of our culture that's what actually makes it so interesting to explore, is, so much is similar that the little differences that we take for granted that Romans would have thought, completely anathema to their way of thinking or their existence. The idea of every citizen actually having a vote that matters. I mean, sure, in Rome, every citizen could vote, but let's be honest, the Senate, they were the only ones who actually mattered. They were going to do whatever they were going to do. And the rest of the citizenry could, go suck on a lemon.
Yeah.
No, I think that gets to the point of, to circle back to the actual room where it is. This is the room where it's the room where everything happened in the Roman Empire or the Roman Republic until it became the Roman Empire, and it was almost critical to the formation of the Roman Empire. So it kind of it is almost, you want to talk like fulcrum. I tend to look for linchpins, Don. You look for Venn diagrams. I look for linchpins. Is this room becomes one of the linchpins of history?
Yeah, no doubt about that. And just to pick up on again the thought that's already been expressed there, so I'm not saying anything new, but maybe saying it a slightly different way. But we mentioned earlier, Cicero was mentioned. The oratory that occurred in the place where the Senate met, be it here or the previous places where the Senate met, was this idea of, while right often did make right in inside of Rome, see Julius Caesar, see others, or the influence of money, see Julius Caesar, see others, in what's there. There was this tradition, and some of the oratory that we have, again, when I studied Latin in college, things that we had that we translated were like, basically Cicero's writings which were drawn from his speeches, but this idea of a place where ideas were expressed, and there was the open expression of ideas there, maybe not as open as folks would have liked in a given day because of, again, might making right, but it was the reason that the United States chose to name one of the two legislative bodies, the Senate, was this idea of a place where deliberation took place. And that was true of the Roman Senate. Even when it was a rubber stamp, it was a place where deliberation took place and discussion took place. Sometimes in an openly vying for the decision to be made, sometimes just in the propaganda / marketing aspect of what's already been done. But it was a place where oratory was important, and that's also carried down to today. Your words matter.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right, Don. And I would just kind of reiterate what I said earlier, that I don't necessarily think the room where Julius Caesar was assassinated was it was less the gas pedal that propelled everything forward so much as it was letting up on the brake that prevented it from happening. And so I think, that to points that Chris and Dylan made, there were a lot of events that happened that made what we would consider to be the Roman Empire. But I think this sort of released the braking mechanism so those things could actually occur.
Yeah, and also created a place for legitimacy for some of the things that have been decided outside of that. I was just in my head, I was thinking through the things that we have from Roman history that are used as phraseology today. One of them that came across, crossing the Rubicon, being an example of that. That was Caesar doing something that once those troops came across, you were taking your legion where you weren't supposed to take your legion because you weren't supposed to bring it back into basically the home territory, right? But that became the idea of, the Dies Cat. I mean, just think about all these things that come from these events in Roman history, which also continue to be the influence of Rome on our culture in general, because it's woven in through our language.
Or our legal structure. I mean, I think about crossing the Rubicon, and like crossing the Rubicon and, posse comitatus is not that different when I think about it. I'm not a lawyer. Dylan, feel free to weigh in here, but like the idea that you don't have, you don't use your military to provide security internally.
Well, and that was kind of the thing that really, I was going to try and tie it back to kind of a cautionary tale, and that is, that's one of the things that really sort of did the Roman Empire in, is it transitioned from a state where, the military was used for external defenses to a place where the military was essentially used to duct tape and glue the whole thing together, in a more unstable regime. Rome is, at the end of the day, also kind of a cautionary tale, because even Don, we talked about this in kind of the episode about the Battle of Actium, but the Romans were pathologically afraid of having a king, and what did them in was that pathological fear, because Augustus didn't just declare that he was emperor. He went through all of the strictures of making the Senate give him all these grants of authority and use the legal structure of the system as it existed to essentially hide in plain sight. He called himself the first man rather than the emperor because he recognized that Julius Caesar tried to essentially be a king, and he said, no, the trick is to have all the powers of a king but not call yourself a king so that the people don't realize that's what you are. The Principate, especially in the first century AD, was this giant con job that the imperial family essentially pulled on the people of Rome with the Senate's acquiescence by faking that everything was business as usual. And I think that's, especially for a Western audience in the modern day where so much of the world is governed by representative democracies like the Republic, I feel like, at least in the back of my mind, I can't imagine I'm the only one, but that's one of the reasons why Rome is constantly sort of brought up and coming to the forefront, is because even we model so much of our current society on the impact of Rome in the culture, the legal systems, the phraseology, that nobody wants to have happen today what happened to Rome. We're so reliant on Rome as a system, yet we know where that went, and yet we don't want it to happen again. And I think that
if I could piggyback off of that, Dylan, it occurred to me, I was thinking through that. Two things came to mind. I've heard the term used multiple, an American Caesar. Again, that's shorthand for something. But then also realizing that the Russian term for Tsar comes from Caesar
and Kaiser.
Yeah, exactly. And back to your point of the cautionary tale part here. And by the way, we've talked about this a number of times off podcast. We strive very hard to not be overtly political on the Fork in Time, and I think we do an excellent job of that for good reason. But Eric, you brought this up, I think, and I just want to say it here just for our listeners' benefit. You may hear us be a little bit more political. We're going to be politely political to the extent that we are, because one of the great things about our team is I actually know our team comes from a diverse thought process when it comes to their politics. And guess what? That's okay. We can talk about it and still be friends and still like it. That's a public service announcement. Take that for what it is or what it's not. But particularly here on the Rim where it happened, you may hear a little bit more on a Fork in Time as well. You may hear that a little bit more, and it's okay because we know how to do it and still like each other when it's over, and maybe even learn something or think about something differently because we had that conversation, which is the other value. But back to your point, Dylan, where it's a cautionary tale, I was thinking back to the 80s and other places. In fact, it's used inside of companies before. We're appointing a czar. We're appointing a czar, a drug czar, or whatever it is. And the concept there was that actually borrows heavily from Rome, and the concept of, giving someone that temporary power for a year to be the ultimate authority because there was some threat, real or potentially imagined, that caused you to need to give somebody that much power. And once they have that power, it's a very rare thing to want to give it up or give it back. And so the cautionary tale there, again, the terms that we even use today, well, an American Caesar, or, we're appointing a fill in the blank of subject matter here, czar, the Russian word for Caesar, that's the cautionary tale too. It may be, there are times when you look at, we need somebody who can cut through all the red tape and just do stuff because it's important enough. We need somebody who can do stuff, right up until it's somebody that you need to stab on March 15th, 44 BC, because you're concerned that he's taken too much power.
And
if that makes any sense.
To bring that back, who was referred to on some level as American Caesar? Even had a book written by William Manchester about him.
That was MacArthur, right?
Yeah.
And again, the model there, you could almost see, thinking about back to MacArthur, who's an interesting character we've talked about many times on this podcast for other things, is MacArthur is a Julius Caesar-esque character to a degree, right? Pacific Theater commander, Korea. Now what I'll do is I'm going to run for president.
He's an excellent marketer.
Yeah. And so that's the reason that's chosen is the parallel that's there. But even in the good ways, we're going to have a drug czar. Again, that's my example. Okay, you probably do need somebody who is capable of pulling together all the elements that you need to pull together, right up until the point that person has too much power. And
By the way,
where does that balance exist?
we want to say that MacArthur is the marketer, or is Eisenhower the marketer who did this for 2 terms without having any of the negative connotation attached to him?
Oh, they were both
I would actually go I might call Eisenhower American Octavian or Octavius. You know, you could almost make that analogy there to some degree.
He knew how to keep it tamped down.
Yeah.
And MacArthur's problem was his ego, as much as anything. And because remember, he, for all intents and purposes, he was Caesar of Japan.
Right. Right.
Yeah, he ran Japan.
Eric, do you have something? I see you unmuted there.
No. Sorry. Apologies, Don.
No worries. No worries. Guys, we could go on and talk about this all night. We would enjoy it. I don't know if our listeners would, but I'm going to sort of bring us around to a close here. This is what I like and why we created this format of the show separate from A Fork in Time, because so often we would get caught in the trap of A Fork in Time of getting so wound up in talking about the historical what did. Oh yeah, we got 10 minutes here. We're going to talk about the what if. And so we decided we needed to create a place where we could just do the what did and talk about its impact without the what ifs. But I'm going to throw it out one more time to the team here. Any big things you think we missed? Anything that you're like, ooh, I definitely needed to say this. I don't want to close this down before we have a chance to throw anything good like that out.
If anything, and I think this may be the new thing for a room where it happened, I love your idea of the Venn diagram, because I think about all of the other rooms we've done and all of the circles that came off of that room, or all of those rooms.
Thanks, Chris.
Yeah, I just we probably should have done this at the beginning, because I know, Don, you talked about our butchery of Latin, but I guess since this will probably go out before the episode on Battle of Actium, maybe, or basically before we get too many of these out of the way, I just want to offer an apology on behalf of the entire staff to anyone who does have familiarity with Latin, Italian, any sort of Romance language, because we're going to inconsistently butcher every single possible name that we could come up with across all of these discussions. So I just want to issue a blanket apology on the front end. We're going to be mixing classical Latin with ecclesiastical Latin with Italian. We'll probably throw in some Spanish in there at some point. It's going to be a hot mess, but it's going to be fun.
Fair enough. I jokingly say all the time, I speak, languages are my Achilles heel. They have been, which is interesting for me taking the year and a half of Latin. Remind me at some point, not now, to tell the story about why I only did a year and a half of Latin too. That's a whole other thing. But Dylan, I appreciate that point. And the other thing that I'll say that's relevant to that, you know, sort of when it comes there is we will butcher language as well. And what I always say about me is I am bilingual. I speak English and I speak something called East Texan, and they sound similar and they're close, but they are in 2 entirely different languages. Let's just be clear about that. All right, Robert, do you have any closing thoughts?
I'm good. I'm looking forward to this series because, as you said, Rome influences everything, and the pebble effect or the butterfly effect of what happens in Rome is just huge as you move through history.
Yeah, the long tails of Roman history is the way that I have them in my head. Eric Rush, any thoughts before we close out?
I just think this is a great way to kick off this whole kind of arc, both on A Fork in Time and A Room Where It Happened. Because we've said this a couple of times that this is a very important room when it comes to the development of what we consider the Roman Empire, but definitely not the only room. So I think this is a wonderful place to start.
Great. Guys, I really appreciate you. You guys know that. I really appreciate our listeners. I hope that we as we reinvigorate the companion podcast here, The Room Where It Happened, to A Fork in Time, and the momentum we have here. We appreciate our listeners sticking with us through our inconsistent period, but this is why I enjoy doing this, because I learned some things today, and that's always a good place to be. And some things that I already knew, I'm rethinking what I think I knew about them, and that's also a good place to be, which is always a handy place to be. One of the things I did want to mention is if you go to aforkintimepodcast.com, that's also where you'll find the home of The Room Where It Happened. So there are resources there for feedback. We have a Discord channel. which we were talking about actually on the Fork in Time. We're getting a lot more traffic there as we're getting back into doing things, and people are finding that. And what I really enjoy about that is there's a place for feedback on the website. Certainly send us an email, fill out a feedback form, give us a topic suggestion, all the things that have been there for a good while. But one of the cool things about the Discord is we're able to respond and then engage in a dialogue back and forth. And so one of the things we always want to do on episodes now, in fact, you'll see this probably incorporated a little bit more on some of Fork in Time episodes. We'll come back and address things that we saw in the Discord on a future episode, sort of close the loop that's coming back around. But if you have thoughts, you guys totally missed it. You didn't even mention this, or, that guy, Don Shelley, he's an idiot. Why did he even say that? You can go and do that on the Discord server, and we'll talk about it, and we can exchange ideas back and forth there. And I've enjoyed interacting with our listeners there. So you'll see a link in the show notes to that. You'll also find that link on the website, which again is not the room where it happened. The website is a forkintimepodcast.com. You'll find other things there, ways that you can support the show through ratings and reviews. If you feel so inclined to provide financial support through our Patreon links. One of the benefits now, particularly that we're in a good rhythm now where we're getting episodes recorded ahead and we have an inventory, is if you're a patron, you get early access to those episodes. If you can't wait till your Friday for a Fork in Time, or can't wait for the release of the room where it happened, you can do that as well. All right. Any closing thoughts? I know I did that before. I'm gonna do it one more time just to make sure nobody missed anything. By the way, there's merch at the website. So if you're bound and determined to have some Fork in Time, whatever, or the room where it happened, or like Alexis has, she has a mug that has both. You can find that stuff there at the website. All right. So for Dylan, Robert, Eric, and Chris, I'm glad that you didn't crash into anything while you were driving earlier. That makes me feel a little bit better. This is Don signing off for the room where it happened. Just reminding you, whatever your room that you are in can be a place where it happens as well. Thanks, guys.